My name is Kevin Dutton. I'm a Professor of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and also at the University of Essex.
Well, I guess the thing is too, even when I mention this to people, they're confused because they think that a psychopath is a killer. I mean, how do you define a psychopath? And has that sort of changed?
Well, it's true. I mean, no sooner is the word psychopath out than people think of serial killers and rapists and terrorists and suicide bombers. But actually, the word psychopath is really a bit of a media misnomer. If we're talking in strictly psychological terms, when you mention a psychopath, what that means is it means a distinct cluster of personality traits which include ruthlessness, fearlessness, charm, charisma, focus, and a lack of conscience. Now, if you put all those traits together in one person and you're naturally violent, notice I didn't include violence within those traits. If you're naturally violent and let's say you're not very intelligent, you don't come from a very good background, you don't have a good schooling, then you're likely to be the kind of person that's going to wind up in serious trouble. You're going to kill someone in a bar brawl or something, you're going to go to prison. But if you have those traits and you are intelligent, you come from a very good school background, and also you are not violent, then you are more likely, as Reuters once said, to make a killing in the market rather than in any other kind of place in a violent brawl.
Yeah, so you actually got interested quite early on when you were at university?
That's right, yeah. My first encounter with a psychopath was, in fact, as a postdoc. And it was in a high security unit, and it was when I was talking to this guy that I first realised basically how manipulative psychopaths really can be. You read about it in the literature and you hear about it secondhand. But the very first time I actually met one and interviewed one was actually pretty scary, and you do sense a kind of a chill in the air when you do actually come across these guys.
Now, you've interviewed many psychopaths from killers to QCs. What are they like?
Well, generally, when you meet a psychopath, they're very charming, they're very charismatic, they do tend to have a definite aura, a definite presence, and there have been studies which have looked at that presence. One study was conducted back in the 90s, in which law enforcement officers and clinicians were asked whether they'd actually felt any strange physiological sensations when interviewing or in the presence of a psychopath, and the vast majority of them did in fact report feeling things like an iciness in the air, feeling creeped out by these guys. And what you usually find, or what this study found in particular, was it tended to be predominantly women that reported those feelings, and also clinicians or law enforcement officers of a lower status. And this kind of taps into the idea that psychopaths are basically emotional predators. They're looking for weaknesses. They're looking for chinks in your armour that they can expose once they've pushed those kinds of buttons. So when you meet a psychopath, they're usually very charming, they're charismatic, but there's also a kind of an intensity in their presence. One of the other reasons for that is to do with the eye contact that they make. Psychopaths tend to have that reptilian stare that's often picked up by the Hollywood film industry, and it's almost as if they're kind of studying you really intently to try to figure out what emotional cues to pick up on. As one psychopath who I interviewed put it, you don't need to have colour vision in order to know how a traffic light works. You just need to know which bits are lit up in order to respond. And that's very much the way psychopaths act and go through life. They don't feel emotions like we do. but they kind of extrapolate. They're good actors. They know how they should respond in certain situations based on the way you are responding. So they see emotions very much in black and white rather than in colour.
Now, you've actually spoken to quite a few very successful ones for this book that's upcoming anyway, and there are a couple of stories you told me about that were really quite striking. Tell me about the neurosurgeon.
Yeah, I interviewed a neurosurgeon who's basically been performing surgery for over 20 years. He takes on operations which tend to be slightly risky, tend to push the envelope a little bit of surgery. And he actually said to me that surgery was a blood sport. He got off on the thrill of the challenge. Now, when anyone, says that to you as a neurosurgeon or basically any kind of surgeon, you might think to yourself, well, I really wouldn't want him operating on me. But actually, when you think about it, those kind of psychopathic characteristics that I was mentioning about are precisely the kinds of traits that you would want to find in a surgeon. That focus, that coolness under pressure. If things go wrong in an operating theatre, you don't want someone to start freaking out and panicking. You want someone to absolutely focus on the job in hand and not get phased out. And also that kind of dispassionate distance that psychopaths have, that kind of cold empathy that they display. Also very important in surgery. Surgeons have to do some pretty nasty things to people in order to make them better. And there's evidence to show that if you have too much empathy, you're obviously not going to be able to function in that capacity as well as you might. I've also interviewed a top barrister over here in the UK. And he also, proved very high, showed that he was very high on the psychopathic spectrum. And, as again, if you think about psychopathic characteristics and how they might pan out in a court of law, I mean, when you go into advocacy, it is a very testosterone-laden, competitive field. You want to win that case. You want to convince the jury that your man is either innocent or the other guy is guilty. And you need to be pretty ruthless when you cross-examine witnesses in the box. Now, this particular QC who I interviewed confided in me that, he can, cross-examine a witness, an alleged rape victim, for instance, and literally, kind of destroy that person's life as they stand up there in the witness box. And, he's fully aware that they can leave the court and perhaps never get over some of the questions that he's asked them, the ordeal that he's put them through. But at the end of the day, he can leave the courtroom, hang up his wig and gown, go out for dinner with his wife at the end of the evening, and literally, not give it a second thought. And the reason for that is because that's his job. That's what he's paid to do. That's what his client has hired him for. Now, if you are worried about the emotional distress that you might, or I should say unduly worried about the emotional distress that you might cause people who you cross-examine, then that's not going to allow you to be perhaps as good an advocate as you would be with a little less, how shall we say, empathy. Now, let me qualify that by saying that that's okay if you have those qualities within the chosen field that you're in. Those kinds of traits which I've just described might be very, very good in an operating theatre, might be very good in a court of law. But once you get outside that kind of occupational field, where they can start leading you into trouble is if you carry them over into everyday life. You certainly wouldn't want to be married to a psychopath, and a lot of people, who are married to psychopaths certainly know it. Psychopaths are very manipulative. They are very good at controlling. And you do find, that psychopaths who are in relationships usually are very controlling and very manipulative. One of the things generally about psychopaths is that their relationships don't last too long. They're very promiscuous and very impulsive, so they will have multiple affairs that usually last for relatively short periods. But when relationships do end with psychopaths, they usually end in tears, and quite a few of them. I think in certain professions, being high on the psychopathic spectrum is a very good thing, and it can confer advantages. Let me just qualify what it means to be a psychopath. It's not a black or white thing. You can't really say a person is a psychopath or isn't a psychopath. You can on one level, but it's better to think, in my opinion, of psychopathy a little bit like height, a little bit like weight, or like IQ, as being on a spectrum. And some of us are kind of further along that spectrum than others. Now, in terms of certain occupations, let's say surgery or law or even the military, I've interviewed certain psychopaths who are in special forces, for instance. That kind of ruthlessness, fearlessness, lack of empathy, focus and charm can really confer advantages in certain professions.
What is psychopathy? What is it in the brain?
Yeah, there's one of the major theories of psychopathy is based on observations that they don't tend to have that fear response that the rest of us have in the normal population. And what we know from looking at fMRI scans when psychopaths are in the brain scanner is that the area of the brain called the amygdala, which is basically the emotion control tower of the brain, right in the middle of the brain, tends to be under-aroused in psychopaths. So what you find is that when you ask psychopaths to perform emotion-related tasks in the lab, their amygdala doesn't fire to the same extent that, say, your or my amygdala might fire.
So it's a fear problem.
It's an emotional under-arousal problem.
So is it an empathy problem?
Well, yeah, when people talk about psychopaths not having empathy, actually what they're generally referring to is psychopaths not having the hot empathy. That empathy that non-psychopaths like you or I might feel when we see someone doing something and we literally feel for them. We can feel their pain. We know what they're going through. Psychopaths have a cold empathy. They have even an enhanced ability over the rest of us to dispassionately gauge what another person might be feeling, might be thinking. And they're very, very good at that. Which even better than the rest of us, actually. So that's one of the reasons why psychopaths make very good persuaders and very good manipulators, because they are able to slip into our emotional airspace and get their point across without feeling that kind of heat and light that most of us get attached to when we're trying to put our point of view. It really matters to us. But as one psychopathic con man who I once interviewed said, never allow yourself to become emotionally involved in an outcome of whatever point of view you're trying to put across. So psychopaths, to say psychopaths don't have empathy is a bit of a generalization. They don't have the hot empathy, the feeling empathy that you or I might have, but what they do have is the ability to gauge cognitively and dispassionately what another person might be thinking and then to respond accordingly.
I guess it allows you to act with impunity if you've grown up never feeling someone else's pain, literally.
It does. And I mean, if you are very intelligent, and this is where we come down to the kind of divide between psychopaths that are very intelligent and psychopaths that aren't. If you are unintelligent and you are violent and you are also psychopathic, then that kind of ability not to feel someone's pain is going to land you in trouble pretty quickly. But if you have that kind of dispassionate bystander kind of cognitive stance, and you're not violent, and also you are very intelligent and have a good education, then that's going to allow you to manipulate and to charm your way up all sorts of ladders. I'm thinking especially in business and, say, in the finance world, for instance.
Given that set of traits, and even there's theories now about the brain basis of psychopathy, are psychopaths born this way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think when we talk about the whole nature-nurture debate in terms of psychopathy, in terms of any kind of psychological dysfunction these days, I think it's kind of old hat. I think what we should really be looking at now is the science of behavior genomics, the science of epigenetics, which shows that, I think psychopaths have a certain genetic predisposition to be that way. But there are certain triggers in a person's environment or a person's background that might either activate that genetic predisposition or might not activate it.
But tell me, so if you have a psychopath in the family, should you panic?
I think if you've got a psychopath in the family and their behaviour is causing distress to other members of the family, and their behaviour is having severe consequences, then I think you should take steps. I think then that's where psychopathy becomes dysfunctional. If you have a psychopath in the family who is in a profession, perhaps, where those psychopathic traits are, of benefit to them in that profession, but they're not spilling over into everyday life, I don't think there's anything there to particularly worry about. But I think when psychopathy does become dysfunctional, when it starts becoming a real problem for those people around the psychopath, is when it starts spilling into everyday life.
So you actually think there's a wisdom in psychopaths?
I do. I think that psychopaths have certain things that, certain personality traits that stand the rest of us in very good stead in our lives. Psychopaths are very assertive. We could all do with being a little bit more, well, most of us could do with being a little bit more assertive in our lives. Psychopaths tend to bounce back very quickly from disappointments. They don't let things get them down. They don't tend to procrastinate. They absolutely live for the day rather than tomorrow. And if they want something, they really go and get it. They're not afraid to win. Whereas sometimes the rest of us might ease off the gas a little bit or pussyfoot around. So there's certain characteristics that psychopaths have that I think all of us could really benefit from in everyday life. I think there's certainly a line to be said for making friends with a little bit more with our inner psychopaths. But it's when those traits boil over into really hurting people, into breaking laws, and that kind of thing, that they start becoming dysfunctional.